History often remembers wars, kings, and disasters, but some of the most extraordinary people were quietly forgotten by time. Tonight, we revisit one of those remarkable stories, a life that deserves to be remembered long after history moved on. If stories like these inspire you, there's always another waiting to be uncovered here. The musket felt heavier than she expected. Rain soaked the camp outside while exhausted soldiers huddled beside weak fires, their uniforms stiff with mud and smoke. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, British troops moved silently through the countryside. The young soldier sitting near the edge of the fire kept mostly to himself. Quiet. Thin. Watchful. No one around him knew the truth. The young man, cleaning his rifle beneath the flickering firelight, was actually a woman named Deborah Sampson. And if her secret were discovered, everything would end. Not only her military career. Possibly her freedom. Possibly her life. Yet despite the danger, Deborah had chosen to walk willingly into war. The American Revolution was still raging during the early 1780s. The 13 colonies fought desperately against British rule while ordinary farmers, laborers, and tradesmen became soldiers almost overnight. It was a brutal and uncertain conflict. Supplies often ran low. Diseases spread rapidly through military camps. Many soldiers went unpaid for months. And for women living in revolutionary America, opportunities remained painfully limited. Women could support the war effort by sewing uniforms, preparing food, caring for wounded soldiers, or maintaining farms while men fought. But they were forbidden from serving as soldiers themselves. Deborah Sampson intended to break that rule. Deborah was born in Massachusetts in 1760 into a poor family struggling to survive. Her childhood was harsh from the beginning. After her father disappeared at sea and never returned, the family fell into deep poverty. Unable to care for all her children, Deborah's mother sent them to live in different households across the region. Deborah eventually became an indentured servant, spending years working for another family until adulthood. But those difficult years shaped her in unusual ways. Unlike many girls of the time, Deborah learned skills traditionally associated with men. She worked outdoors, handled tools, performed physical labor. She also developed something even more important: independence. As Deborah grew older, she became fascinated by the Revolutionary War unfolding around her. Young men marched proudly through towns wearing Continental Army uniforms. Stories of battles spread across taverns and churches. The war represented danger, but also possibility. For men, military service offered wages, purpose, and recognition. For women, society offered far fewer choices. Deborah refused to accept those limits quietly. At first, she reportedly attempted teaching school and working as a seamstress. But by 1782, she made a decision almost unthinkable for a woman in colonial America. She would disguise herself as a man and join the Continental Army. The plan required extraordinary courage. Women discovered impersonating soldiers could face punishment, humiliation, or imprisonment. Military camps were harsh environments filled with constant physical exposure and medical inspections. Maintaining such a deception seemed nearly impossible. But Deborah prepared carefully. She cut her hair shorter, bound her chest tightly, practiced walking and speaking differently. And eventually, under the name Robert Shurtliff, she enlisted in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. no one suspected the truth. Life inside the Continental Army was miserable even for experienced soldiers. Food shortages were common. Uniforms wore thin during long marches. Winters became brutal tests of endurance. Deborah now lived constantly surrounded by men who could expose her secret at any moment. Every conversation required caution. Every injury carried risk. Even sleeping became dangerous. Yet somehow, she adapted remarkably well. Historical records suggest Deborah stood unusually tall for a woman of her era, close to 5 feet 8 inches, which may have helped her pass more convincingly as a young male soldier. She trained beside the other recruits. Marched with them. Carried weapons. And eventually entered combat. One of Deborah's most dangerous experiences occurred during fighting near Tarrytown, New York. During battle, she reportedly suffered wounds from enemy fire. According to later accounts, Deborah feared military doctors would discover her identity if they treated her injuries properly. So instead of seeking help, she secretly removed a musket ball from her own leg using a sewing needle and penknife. The wound never healed correctly afterward. Some historians believe she carried pieces of metal in her body for the rest of her life. Whether every detail of the self-surgery story is fully accurate remains debated among scholars because some accounts emerged later through autobiographical retellings. However, most historians agree Deborah intentionally avoided medical examination to protect her identity. That much appears strongly supported by historical evidence. And the fact alone reveals how carefully she guarded her secret. Deborah continued serving for over a year. That fact remains extraordinary. This was not a brief disguise maintained for days or weeks. She lived among soldiers for extended periods without exposure. She participated in military duties, guard assignments, combat operations, long marches across difficult terrain, all while maintaining constant vigilance over her hidden identity. The emotional strain alone must have been enormous. Every fever, every injury, every inspection, every accidental glance from another soldier could have ended everything instantly. Eventually, however, maintaining the deception became impossible. In 1783, Deborah became seriously ill while stationed near Philadelphia. A doctor named Barnabas Binney examined her during treatment and discovered the truth. But instead of exposing her publicly in humiliation, Binney reportedly acted with compassion. Historical accounts suggest he treated her privately and kept the matter discreet for some time. Even then, Deborah's military service did not end immediately. She continued performing duties until her identity was formally revealed later that year. On October 25, 1783, Deborah Sampson received an honorable discharge from the Continental Army. That detail matters deeply. She was not branded a criminal. Not publicly disgraced. Not imprisoned. Instead, official records acknowledged her service respectfully. General Henry Knox himself reportedly signed documents related to her discharge. That recognition quietly separated Deborah's story from scandal. Her courage had become difficult to dismiss. But Deborah's struggles did not end after the war. Like many veterans of the Revolution, she faced financial hardship afterward. She married a farmer named Benjamin Gannett and attempted building a stable life in Massachusetts. Yet money remained scarce. And unlike male veterans, women often faced additional barriers when seeking pensions or recognition for military service. Deborah spent years petitioning the government for compensation connected to her time in the army. Some officials questioned her claims. Others doubted a woman could have served effectively as a soldier at all. Still, Deborah persisted. Eventually, her story attracted public attention. And something remarkable happened. Deborah Sampson became one of the first American women to lecture publicly about her own life. She traveled across parts of New England speaking before audiences about the Revolutionary War and her experiences disguised as a soldier. During some presentations, she reportedly dressed once again in military uniform and demonstrated battlefield drills using a musket. Imagine the shock audiences must have felt. A woman standing before them openly describing how she had entered a world society insisted women could never occupy. Not through permission, but through sheer determination. Years later, prominent figures including Paul Revere supported Deborah's efforts to receive a proper military pension. Revere himself reportedly wrote letters praising her character and service. Eventually, the government granted Deborah financial support recognizing her role in the revolution. Today, historians widely regard her as one of the few women confirmed to have served in combat during the American Revolutionary War while disguised as a man. That distinction makes her story historically extraordinary. Not mythical. Not exaggerated legend. Documented history. Still, parts of Deborah Sampson's life remain uncertain. Some dramatic details surrounding her battlefield experiences emerged through later retellings, autobiographical accounts, and 19th-century storytelling traditions that occasionally blurred fact and embellishment. Historians continue debating certain specifics. But the central truth remains undeniable. Deborah Sampson enlisted illegally under a false male identity. Served in the Continental Army. Participated in military operations. Suffered injuries. And completed honorable service during the American Revolution. Few stories from that era reveal the limitations placed upon women, and the determination required to overcome them, as powerfully as hers. There is something deeply human about Deborah's decision. She did not fight because society welcomed her into the army. It did not. She fought because the world she lived in offered her no acceptable path toward the life she wanted. So she created one herself. At enormous risk. And perhaps that is why her story continues surviving centuries later. Because beneath the military disguise and historical mystery lies a timeless truth. Some people refuse to let society decide the limits of who they are allowed to become. Today, Deborah Sampson's legacy occupies a unique place in American history. Not only as a Revolutionary War soldier, but as someone who challenged expectations long before the modern language for such resistance even existed. She lived during a time when women possessed few legal rights, little independence, and almost no public authority. Yet somehow, she crossed into one of the most restricted spaces imaginable. A wartime army. And she survived there. Near the end of her life, Deborah reportedly continued suffering from health problems connected to years of physical hardship and wartime injuries. She died in 1827 at the age of 66. Long after the guns of the Revolution had fallen silent. Long after most soldiers returned home and disappeared into ordinary history. But Deborah Sampson never vanished completely. Because history remembers people who quietly refuse impossible limits. And in the freezing camps and battlefields of the American Revolution, a young woman once carried a musket through war while the world believed she did not belong there at all.